Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al-Arabiya headquarters with a special programme on Syria. The country's new leader, Ahmed Al-Sharaa, has given a wide-ranging interview to the network where he discussed and outlined many critical issues, including the length of the transition period in Syria and regional security. These are our top headlines. In an exclusive interview, Syria's new leader tells Al-Arabiya elections will be in 4 years. Rebuilding relationships across Syria is also top priority for the new leader as he confirms talks with the SDF to resolve the crisis in the northeast. And Al-Sharaa praises support from Saudi Arabia, saying the kingdom has major investment opportunities in the country. Welcome to the show. Speaking exclusively to Al-Arabiya in Damascus, Syrian leader Ahmed Al-Sharaa discusses in detail what's next for the war-torn country, from its relations with the US and Iran to holding legitimate elections. We begin with the latter, which its leader says could be organised in 4 years' time. Al-Sharaa also said that a population census is crucial before the country's new leaders can be elected.
The process of conducting a population census in Syria requires time, as does the legal communication with Syrian communities abroad through embassies and the redocumentation of new births and past deaths. For instance, someone who left the country at the age of 10 is now 24 years old. We are dealing with a very broad situation that demands precise accounting of all Syrians, whether they are inside the country or in the diaspora. This matter requires time. Is it possible that the elections could happen in 4 years? It's possible.
Meanwhile, Al-Sharaa is warning that a quota system would undermine the Syrian state and adds that the next stage will involve an interim government made up of qualified individuals.
This is a Syrian problem. Let us solve it. Syrian to Syrian. We are trying to find a suitable solution for the situation in northeastern Syria, based on fundamental principles. There must be no division of Syria, and we must not entrench the idea of division in any form, even in a federal form. Our society is not yet ready to understand the nature of federal systems.
The new Syrian leader also says that the Kurds are an integral part of the Syrian fabric and that protecting them is the responsibility and the priority of the state. He adds that qualified armed Kurds will be included in the ranks of the Ministry of Defense.
The Kurds are part of our people, and they have been wronged just like us. It's our duty to protect and support them and to return them to some of the villages they were displaced from during the revolution. This is our responsibility. Based on these principles, those armed in northeastern Syria, the Ministry of Defense should also ensure that weapons are exclusively under state control. For those who are armed and qualified to join the Ministry of Defense, we welcome them into its ranks. Under these conditions and regulations, we are open to a negotiation path with the SDF.
For more on this, I'm joined by Sir William Patey, the former British ambassador to Iraq, who has extensive first-hand experience witnessing part of the country's transition period after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Sir William, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this evening. Firstly, what do you make of the new Syrian leader suggesting the country's first election since Assad's downfall may be in 4 years' time?
I think that's a reflection of the reality. You have a country that's been completely destroyed by the Assad regime, and it's going to take time to rebuild. I was very struck by the new leader's words. He's saying all the right things. I think it would take one of the problems is we often rush to have elections without having made all the right preparations, having a decent constitution and preparation for elections, allowing the Syrian diaspora to return and take part in these elections. So the important thing is to maintain a decent government and build the institutions.
Do you think there's any risk in this timeline, this 4-year timeline? As you said, it's all about, bringing the fabric back together, rebuilding.
Well, there obviously is a risk, and if he doesn't mean what he says, then he'll be in a position to consolidate power amongst a smaller group. But the intention to dissolve the Hayat al-Tahrir al-Shams, the revolutionary organisation which he headed, is a good sign. Appointing ministers not based on sectarianism or factionalism is also a good sign. What they need to do is to create a legal system, allow freedom of the press, build up an armed forces that is answerable to the government, avoid mistakes of other countries where armed militias were able to exercise political influence well beyond democratic elections.
So you've actually brought me to my next question about other countries. You have extensive experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan, witnessing state building and transitions in these real complex environments. What are the biggest challenges ahead, in your view, for Syria?
Well, I think Syria is in an even more difficult position than Afghanistan, say, or Iraq, because there are many more external players, each with interests that could contradict. Russia will want to protect its military interests. Iran will want to protect its ability to resupply Hezbollah. Turkey will want to make sure that the Kurds in the northeast do not become a threat to them. And the Americans will want to ensure that their allies in the northeast, the SDF, are able to continue to suppress Daesh or ISIS. So there are lots of countries with different interests. I know that the Gulf countries will be suspicious of Islamist governments, but they need to work closely with Turkey to build up, give the Syrians some quick wins, rebuild the hospitals, rebuild the schools, get some of the institutions up and running, and avoid just pursuing their narrow regional interests. Now, that's easier said than done, but I think engagement with the new regime is absolutely vital for the Americans, for the European Union, for Britain and regional states.
Do you think that the tone that has been struck in this interview by Al-Sharaa will actually make the countries feel more confident in him going forward? As you said, there could be suspicion about his governance, but it seems to be that he is striking a somewhat, democratic tone. He wants to rebuild. He wants change.
There'll be a lot of scepticism, given his background, where he came from, a member of Jabhat al-Nusra. He was associated with Al-Qaeda, so there will be scepticism there. But whoever his PR firm is, they deserve huge credit because he's saying all the right things. But I think countries will judge him and his allies by what they do, not necessarily by what they say. They're certainly saying all the right things. And we see, as a result of that, the American government lifting the bounty on his head, the British government and other governments engaging with this new government, interim government in Damascus. And that's all a good sign.
Let's just talk about the US. They still have sanctions imposed on Syria from the Assad era. Under what conditions could they remove these, in your view, and how long could it possibly take?
Well, I think sanctions should begin to be lifted on the Syrian government as they roll out their transition program. As you say, the sanctions were imposed on an Assad regime that is no longer there. Therefore, the justification for the sanctions is no longer there. Obviously, Ahmed Al-Sharaa brings some baggage with him, given his former affiliations. But the US have already lifted the $10 million bounty on his head. I think as he begins to implement the plan they have laid out, that would be the sign to very quickly start lifting sanctions.
So one of the key remaining issues, you actually touched on it a little bit earlier, is to unite Syria and the future of the Syrian democratic forces in the country's northeast. They want governance in those regions, but Al-Sharaa in the interview has ruled out any divisions, and he's really calling for unity across the country. Do you think the SDF will comply?
Well, that's a tricky one. I think they will want to. They will take advice from their American allies. I don't think they could survive without the American allies. I don't think the Syrians want to have a situation in Iraq where like in Iraq, where you have an autonomous Kurdish region. You can give devolved government to governors. You could create regional autonomies or regional governance without dividing the country. And it will be important that the SDF are represented and the Kurds more broadly are represented in any government in Damascus. But it's important to learn lessons where governments have been formed entirely on a factional or sectarian basis, and the spoils have been divided on this basis. What they need is the rule of law for everyone, a system that everyone can rely on, that there's a legal system that will give them justice, and that they will have access to resources, and they will play their part in rebuilding Syria. And the 3 million Syrian refugees, they're going to have a huge role to play as well.
So, William Patey, the former British ambassador to Iraq, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Let's turn our attention to Syria's relationship with Arab and Gulf countries. The Syrian leader points out that the latest events spared a major regional war, calling the current stage in Syria historic. Al-Sharaa says Israel had planned to enter Syria, which would have led to Iran's involvement, dragging in Iraq and then also Turkey.
My assessment of this phase is that it marks a significant historical turning point in the region. The area was on the verge of a large-scale regional war. There was talk of Israeli intervention in the region and in Syria, with claims that it would be the largest war following Gaza and Lebanon. This was a real possibility, because if Israeli forces had entered Syria, it would have inevitably prompted the Iranians to involve Iraq in countering this advance. Consequently, Turkey, feeling deeply concerned about the Israeli advance, would likely take positions, in my view, against the Israelis and aligned with the Iranians. This situation would undoubtedly be exploited by Russia to divert attention from the war in Ukraine, leading to inevitable American reactions.
Now he stresses that the swift war to topple the Assad regime secured the region and the Gulf states for the next 50 years.
The swift war ensured the security of the entire region from these potential threats and fundamentally secured the Gulf's safety for the next 50 years. It also safeguarded Turkey's national security, Syria's national security primarily, and the security of the region as a whole.
Al-Sharaa has also indicated that Saudi Arabia is seeking stability in Syria. He adds that the kingdom has a major role in the future of the country.
The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is striving to bring stability to Syria. They will also be partners in the developmental efforts we are pursuing. While Syria is indeed a devastated country, it also represents a significant investment opportunity for all neighboring countries capable of implementing strategic projects with substantial returns that will benefit these nations. I am proud of everything they have done so far. Delegations came to us to pave the way for starting new relations and building balanced strategic partnerships with Saudi Arabia.
And I'm pleased to say joining us now is the chairman of the Gulf Research Centre, Dr. Abdulaziz Saqr. Good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening to you. Very pleased to be here with you tonight.
Thank you. Yes. So, first of all, what did you make of Ahmed Al-Sharaa's statements as one of the most prominent strategists in the region yourself?
Well, first, I must admit I was very pleased with the way how he answered some of the tough questions that Al-Arabiya journalist Tahir Baraka put him through. He really interrogated him with all the questions and tough questions that it may not have all the answer at this stage. But however, he came out quite calm, precise and structural in his answers. And so I think the biggest concern in the region, Saudi Arabia and the rest of the country, will be the safety and security of Syria inside. How to get the different actors together, how to have an inclusive policy together to bring all the Syrian different players and parties together. As you know, Saudi Arabia in 2015 and 2017 have hosted the Syrian opposition conference in Riyadh, and that have led to Riyadh Declaration, which really set the ground correctly for all the Syrian opposition of how do we wish and how do we see the future of the Syrian in precise. Yes, he came out and he talked about the development and the requirement. He talked about his childhood in Saudi Arabia and the way how he saw it when he was a young child. He talked about the relation and the necessity of going through a constitution and state building, which is all highly appreciated and it's all very much welcomed. I think he did receive enough and good endorsement as of today by the big neighboring country and also by the international power. We are at a monitoring stage now to see and monitor how things will progress there. We hope and we will, that the Syrian people will respond positively to all the things that he said, and we hope he will be able to get the big conference that he promised. For all to have an inclusive of all the Syrian inside and outside, to talk about the future of Syria, whether it's a constitution, a state building, relation of the neighborhood, relation of the external power that exists in Syria, like Russia and the other, the economic development, to treat the suffering of the people. They went through 50 years of a tough life in Syria. We all sympathize with them.
As Al-Sharaa said, that liberating Syria ensures the security of the region, the Gulf and Syria, for the next 50 years. What do you make of these comments?
I think he meant that Iran's presence by using sectarianism as a tools of regional expansion and by endorsing certain militia, because Iran always wanted to deal with militia, but not with the state as a state. I think today they have a chance, honestly, in Iran to come out and say, as Assad used to say, or they used to say, we have been in Syria because we were invited and we were asked by the Syrian regime. Today the Syrian regime is no longer there. So it's better they come out clearly and said, listen, we're no longer needed there, at least to have a safe facing device, in a way, to leave some margin for a future reasonable relation to the Arab country. As he said, with no interventionist policy, with no imposing of any sort of ideology to the people in the Arab world and in Syria in particular. So if Syria settled today, if we are sure that the Iranian presence has been eliminated and out of Syria today, the rest of the country can enjoy a better, peaceful and security in the region, as there's nobody using sectarianism as a dimension, supporting militia and expansionist policy in the region.
Many observers have noticed with which speed the governments of the region responded to Al-Sharaa just days after he took control of that situation in Syria. We all know that some of these governments were suspicious of parties that could possibly have succeeded Assad. If you could explain to us why there was such a change regarding this situation. Was it a principle basis? Did you think that Al-Sharaa was probably the right man to make this change in Syria, in your opinion?
Well, first, we were all happy to see Assad is out and the Syrian people at least feel the freedom from such brutal regime that have really suppressed them for 50 years and so. Al-Sharaa, I think he came out quite clear in a lot of his statement. He addresses the subject quite clearly. I think he did speed up the release of the prisoner and opening the jails and release people from that one, and that more than 50,000 people, they were still inside there. I think he sent a clear indication of normalizing a good relation to the neighboring country, which is very important. He sent a clear signal of his future plan, which include, as I say, the constitution and the inclusive policy of all parties. He did talk about the Kurd, Casin in Syria, and he also talked about a good neighborhood with countries like Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. So all the positive messages that he have sent, it did give a good indication, and it gave a very positive signal to the neighboring country to send their ministers or special delegation, to meet, to ensure what he have said is going to be implemented, and to also ensure that we want to see safety and security, because you can't move toward development and reconstruction and rebuilding Syria if there is no safety and security. So first you have to bring safety and security. And to achieve that, you're going to need the consensus of the people, you're going to need the people's support and endorsement of such things, and you're going to need a proper steps that he takes to ensure certain things.
So I just want to ask one thing. When we're looking at Saudi Arabia, will they be looking to invest in Syria to ensure things like security in the country and development? What do you think the future plans are?
You know, the Israelis have destroyed, unfortunately, most of the Syrian military capability. But so I think what is required now is to ensure building up a security, internal security capability, to make sure that all the different provinces from the north and south and east and west, are secured, and there is a good law and order. So policing, Coast Guard, domestic security to ensure a good judiciary system to be implemented. People, they need to feel they will not be taking for, like what they used to do with them before with the Assad regime. But at least, there is a good judiciary system, there is a good law to be implemented, and there is a personal safety. This will ensure the return of all this, people that they were forced to go to Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Turkey, and all these places, the return of these people. But yet, to have the return of these people, they need a lot of special preparation also to be able to welcome them back.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, and also Happy New Year to you. Thank you for your insights. Thank you. I really appreciate it. That was the chairman of the Gulf Research Centre, Dr. Abdulaziz Saqr.
Thank you.
With regards to his group's activity in Syria and across the region, this was Al-Sharaa's response.
What happened today was that there was a disease that lingered in the Arab countries for 40 years and was removed in just 11 days. We did not enter Tehran, nor did we go to southern Lebanon. We entered our own villages and towns. Therefore, when some talk about conflict or similar terms, the reality is that we never entered Tehran. These are our villages, provinces, and towns that were destroyed over the heads of their inhabitants.
Meanwhile, he also says that the project to export the Iranian revolution under the banner of resistance has significantly harmed the region. He highlights its role in fueling sectarian strife, triggering civil wars and fostering widespread corruption.
The project of exporting the Iranian revolution to Arab countries under the pretext of using Palestine and relying on a specific sect has had a significant impact on the region. In every place the Iranians have entered, or where the Iranian project has taken root, such as Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, it has consistently exhibited similar characteristics. First, the region experiences intense sectarian strife, often leading to civil wars. Second, there is widespread administrative corruption at the level of government and public institutions. Third, it coincides with the large-scale production and spread of Captagon and other drugs in the region. Damascus, once the cradle of ancient civilization and heritage, has now become the world's largest producer of Captagon, exporting it to countries all over the world.
Meanwhile, Al-Sharaa also stressed that Iran must not use Syria as a platform to attack other countries.
We strive to calm tensions and build balanced and strategic relationships as much as possible. There is a wound among the Syrian people caused by Iran, and we need considerable time for these wounds to heal. Most importantly, Iran must not consider using Syria as a platform to attack or disrupt other countries again. We have fulfilled our duty as a state by protecting their embassy and safeguarding sites. And the religious shrines? Yes, and the religious shrines that concern them, to prevent any provocations or similar incidents. This is our duty as a state toward another state. I expected them to appreciate this and to issue positive statements toward the Syrian people and society. They should have chosen to stand with the people because, in the end, the people will prevail no matter what. Instead, they aligned themselves with a regime that has oppressed these people.
Now let's turn our attention to Syria's relationship with the whole world. Syria's new leaders are seeking bigger and better international relations following the fall of the Assad regime. Al-Sharaa has focused greatly on reconstruction and economic development, saying on numerous occasions that Syria is not interested in another war. One factor looming over these efforts is Al-Sharaa's group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which has been designated as a terror organization by the likes of the US and the UK. For the first time, while speaking exclusively to Al Arabiya, Al-Sharaa has confirmed that the dissolution of HTS will be announced at the National Dialogue Conference. He says the event will be inclusive, representing all segments of society, with a voting system to decide sensitive issues.
Will you dissolve HTS? Certainly, running a state cannot be done with the mindset of factions and groups. Since we were in Idlib, we were mentally and emotionally prepared for this. But the right opportunity never presented itself. The opportunity to govern is the best chance to dissolve HTS, and we would be the first to support this dissolution. When do you think this might happen? I believe it will happen during the conference. At the National Dialogue Conference, there will be an official announcement about it. That's quite a surprise. I think this is exclusive news for you, exclusive for Al Arabiya.
For more on this, I'm joined from Istanbul by Mesut Hakki Joshin, a professor of international law and was a member of the Turkish President's Security and Foreign Policy Board. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Professor. Talks between the new Syrian government and the SDF are ongoing. What kind of expectations does Turkey have from these discussions at the moment?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to give an opportunity to me what will happen about the new Syria. I have to most importantly, we have to underline the Iran has lost influence in the region. Secondly, Russian army withdraw weapons and with personnel, and United States SATCOM troops continue to remain in the region, and Israel continues aggressive attacks and also occupation the Golan Heights. For Turkey, first of all, PKK-APG must lay down its arms and dismantle itself. Secondly, all countries must readmit ISIS, the military citizens, with their family members. The Syrian governments will determine Syrian citizens about these members of the terrorist organization, how they will integrate to the new Syrian government. However, Mr. Erdogan indicating today, Turkey cannot accept PKK-APG the terrorist organization operating in Syria. It is a threat against the Turkish territorial integrity. And they don't represent the Kurds in the region, and we must prevent ISIS taking advantage don't permit the Israel undermining new process in the Golan Heights. Also importance, the establishing new Syria in which all ethnic religious groups live side by side in peace, ensuring unity into the country, Mr. Erdogan said in today. When we're looking for myself, one is Turkey looking 5 important points. One is territorial integrity and independence, new Syria administration. Secondly, constitutional framework establishment with democratic elections as soon as, and normalizing public order and stability, and the coming back Syrian citizens to the country in safety mode. Well, almost 7 million people is outside. Another idea is humanitarian assistance with international community. We must work together, and Ankara is communicate with the EU and United Nations leaders, even though cooperation with the Muslim countries, the economic cooperation, re-establishment, the public order, and opening international, such as the airport, Laskia, Tartus, the harbors, and most important, the Turkey opened the new embassy for the establishment dialogue and also international system. For us, the Assad, the dictatorial regime was collapsed. Secondly, the torture and crimes end of these secret Palestinian services, they threat the citizens of the Syrian people. These are very good news for the new year. And Al-Sharaa is also suspicious what will be the changes in Syria. I am hopeful the future of the Syria. I hope according to international law, they will decide about their future according to self-determination right.
You say that you're hopeful, and obviously we heard from Al-Sharaa earlier in the show saying it will be about 4 years until elections will be held. What do you think of this timeline?
Yes, for some people it's been a long time. However, when you're looking the states, the history, 61 years Assad regime and Baas was killed the people. The normalizing the country is not very easy. I'm hopeful about it. It's not long time. Will be quicker then. This depends on how can we establish the law order and even though justice in terms of the international system. I'm hopeful we can do it with the Syrian people if they determine they can accomplish. Why? There is most important issue. There is freedom now. There is election of without any threat or how can I say pressure by the Assad regime will be quicker than this 4 years. But I am again underline that if the Syrian people can decide it, and also if the international community, especially the Muslim countries, brotherhoods, such as just a moment ago, you talked with the Saudi Arabia governments, if we can assist on the economically and humanitarian side, this country is very rich, and Turkey is aimed to be a rich Syria and normalizing as soon as returning back to the international community.
So we've seen the new government's rhetoric towards both Turkey and Saudi Arabia. It's been very positive. Syria's new foreign minister is Turkish educated and making one of his first trips abroad to Saudi Arabia soon. Do you think we are witnessing the beginning of a new axis in the region? Things are beginning to shift.
Very good question. Thank you so much. I hope Turkey was stopped in the right time of the history and right side. So thank you so much to Saudi Arabia, the administration, to assist them, even though United Arab Emirates and Egyptians. We are Muslim, and we are beginning new century, and all the Muslim countries has to focus on what's happening in Israel and the threat. They occupied the Syria, even though they also every day attacking to the Syrian army, 80% weapons was out of order. I'm coming originally the Air Force. They don't have now the Air Force power capability. So Turkey and also Saudi Arabia and other countries is ready to assist them, first economically, even though establishing the normalizing relations, even though security side. Everybody have to be understood that Syria people not alone. The Turkish Brotherhood and Turkish military all the time ready to assist them to them. You remember that? Turkey from the 12 years assisted to 8 million people Syrian refugee in our country. And also Turkish military protect 8 million people in Idlib area. So we have to focus on all the praying countries, soldiers, which as soon as leave out, even though PKK, APG terrorist people. The secondly, we are ready to education, trade, transportation, and normalization public order, even though law mechanism, and also humanitarian assistance, because of the Syrian people, our brotherhood, believe thousands of years in the same country of the Mesopotamia. In this critical year, coming with the good news for the Syrian people, inshallah ta'ala, they will cooperate together their power without any conflict, no more civil war, no more kill the people in the jail.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us from Istanbul. It was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. Mesut, Hakki, Jashan there joining us. During the interview, Al-Sharaa urged the incoming Trump administration to lift sanctions on Syria, saying that they increase the burden on the Syrian people. Take a listen.
We emphasized an important issue, which is the sanctions imposed on Syria. These laws, such as the Caesar Act and others, were issued based on crimes committed by the regime against the victims, including us. Today, the victims are the ones who have overthrown this regime, so with the regime's removal, these sanctions should automatically be lifted. We hope the new U.S. administration will not follow the same approach as the previous one and will lift them without negotiations or compromises.
And to Russia, Al-Sharaa tells Al-Arabiya that he seeks to maintain strategic relations. He adds that he does not want Russia to exit in a manner that undermines its relationship with Syria.
Russia is an important country and is also considered the second strongest country in the world. There are deep strategic interests between Syria and Russia. For instance, all Syrian weaponry is Russian. Many power stations are built with Russian expertise as well. Additionally, there are significant cultural ties between Syria and Russia. So, we do not want Russia to leave Syria in the way some may wish. I am confident that Syria is capable, has an independent character, and does not yield to pressure.
Now to a reminder of our top stories today. In an exclusive interview, Syria's new leader tells Al-Arabiya elections will be in 4 years. Rebuilding relationships across Syria is also top priority for the new leader as he confirms talks with the SDF to resolve the crisis in the northeast. And Al-Sharaa praises support from Saudi Arabia, saying the kingdom has major investment opportunities in the country. And that's all from us on W News this evening. Thank you for joining me. Riz Khan is coming up next. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night to you.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al-Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al-Arabiya News. I'm Joanne Syria. Before opposition forces toppled the government, Syria, a land of ancient history and cultural richness, was plunged into darkness for over a decade. What began in 2011 as peaceful protests was met with unimaginable brutality by Bashar al-Assad's regime, transforming the country into a battlefield. The toll has been devastating. More than 500,000 lives lost, millions displaced, and countless numbers of Syrians gone missing in the shadows of prisons and detention centers. Among these shadows, one of the most haunting revelations came from the Caesar files. This collection of tens of thousands of snapshots smuggled out of Syria by a defector by the name of Caesar exposed the systematic torture and killing of detainees in regime prisons. The images captured a stark reality: starved bodies, victims of brutal torture, and even children who were executed. Representing nearly 7,000 victims, these photos became undeniable evidence of crimes against humanity. But the Caesar files are more than just a collection of images. They revealed the depths of the al-Assad regime's brutality and underscored the urgent need for accountability. Caesar risked his life to gather and smuggle this evidence, but he didn't work alone. Osama Uthman, known by his alias Sammy, was a close collaborator, helping to document and preserve these images at great personal risk. Together, they safeguarded evidence that not only brought global attention to the regime's atrocities, but also paved the way for the Caesar Act, a U.S. law imposing sanctions on the al-Assad regime to limit its ability to continue its war against the Syrian people. As a crucial player in this effort, Sammy helped Caesar navigate the dangers of smuggling the files out of Syria. For Sammy, this wasn't just about exposing the regime's crimes. It was about justice, about giving a voice to the victims, and ensuring that their stories would not be buried. Al-Arabiya spoke to Sammy to hear his firsthand account of the risks, what happened along the way, and what he and Caesar had hoped to achieve. He also shares his thoughts on his home country after the fall of the al-Assad regime. Sammy begins by reflecting on the significance of taking on a second name or identity during the uprising, like the names Sammy or Caesar, and explains the dangers faced by those in the revolution and how adopting a second name became a means of survival, not just a symbolic act.
During the revolution, every Syrian who was part of it gained a second name, born at different stages, perhaps early in the revolution itself. For example, before Osama Othman became Sami, my colleague, a defector, turned into Caesar. This duo's story began around early 2014. As I mentioned, this isn't just about Sami and Caesar, it's about all children of the Syrian revolution, each of whom had two names. One given by their mother at birth, and another bestowed by the revolution that gave them new life. Today, the two names have merged in a crucible of victory. When you call me Osama, I turn instinctively. When you call me Sami, I also instinctively respond. This phenomenon compelled us, and all Syrians in the revolution, to adopt shields to protect ourselves and our loved ones, stemming from a decision to bear the weight of this revolution. To protect others, family and loved ones who didn't make this choice, from a criminal regime that could retaliate cruelly, even against second or third degree relatives, we had to shield ourselves behind symbolic aliases. These risks have been borne by all Syrians who took part in the revolution. We are not detached from this reality. Our identities became intertwined with these symbolic names starting in early 2014. Sami's name, for instance, may have been born in a moment of choice, but Caesar's name was born twice. Caesar was born twice. The first time Caesar was born was when he escaped Damascus and left the country in a complex process.
Rooted in personal stories and moments that marked new beginnings, he recounts how the names Sami and Caesar were chosen.
Initially, we approached this situation as a legal matter, an important case for human rights. Typically, the key witness in such cases is referred to as the Crown Witness. We deliberated for a long time over a name for this Crown Witness. Someone suggested the name Caesar. I was also asked what name I'd like to use moving forward. I thought of my dearest friend I left behind in Syria and chose the name Sami. That's how Sami came to be. As for Caesar, as I mentioned, his birth occurred twice. First with his escape from Syria. But when it comes to the question, who is Caesar? I believe only Caesar himself can answer.
But why hasn't Caesar revealed his true identity? Sami attributes this to the persistent threat posed by the Syrian regime, questioning whether anyone can truly assert that it has come to an end.
The issue lies with the number of people who might perceive you as a threat. While the Syrian regime was indeed a danger to us, who can definitively say that the regime has fallen? Can anyone today claim that the Syrian regime is over? The Syrian regime isn't just Bashar al-Assad. It's an entire system. Thousands have blood on their hands and have violated the rights and lives of Syrians. So I wouldn't say the danger has completely disappeared. That's why revealing Caesar's true identity is a decision I leave entirely to him. I respect that completely, and I promised him, when we left Syria, that I'd protect him until the very end.
While Sami describes his escape from Syria as rather normal, Caesar's escape was filled with risks.
As for me, I left the country in a normal matter. I wasn't personally wanted by the regime, so I left through normal channels, and the families were evacuated quietly. The last person to leave was Caesar, whose escape was complicated and fraught with risks. We enlisted the help of someone we knew who had experience with such operations. At the time, there was a former member of parliament from our city named Mohammed Bomo, if I recall correctly. The process took an entire month of attempts before it succeeded, during which Caesar faced numerous dangers. I've come to believe he's far braver than I initially thought. This marks Caesar's physical birth. The first birth, of course, was before he became Caesar. There's much information about the nature of our work, the technical details of the escape, and the process of documenting evidence. However, we're still cautious about disclosing these details. We presented testimonies before courts in France and Germany, and we must prevent these details from circulating in the media.
During the interview, Sami also addresses misconceptions about the Caesar files, clarifying the actual scale of the documentation and its importance. He went on to describe working with Caesar to document the atrocities.
The claim of 55,000 images is incorrect. It was about 27,000 snapshots, not images, because each corpse was photographed multiple times, 4, 5 or 6 shots, depending on the condition of the body and the injuries. Therefore, there were fewer than 7,000 victims of torture, and the figure of 55,000 is entirely inaccurate and not something we use. These images are part of the case file. Documenting the images was almost a daily process. My close friendship with Caesar as an old friend, as well as our very close family ties, played a role. In Syria, you cannot trust someone simply because they're a classmate, a childhood friend, or even a sibling. The regime turned everyone into a complex security threat, like something out of George Orwell's 1984. This long-standing relationship between Caesar and me enabled us to work together on a near-daily basis. Caesar would return from work almost every day and provide me with some of these images, which I would save on my devices and archive. I'd like to clarify that Caesar did not live in another city. He lived in the same city. I met with him almost daily, as I mentioned, and we exchanged flash drives or other storage devices. He frequently changed his methods due to the severe risks he faced while travelling from his residence to his workplace. He had to cross 2 areas with differing military control, making him vulnerable to targeting from both sides, either as a soldier working for the regime or as someone engaging in work that, if discovered, would result in a disaster for both him and me. We used both methods to preserve the data, ensuring its safety in case we were targeted. The city we were in was invaded by the army, and computers we owned were confiscated multiple times. Fortunately, they had nothing significant on them. We felt a heavy responsibility, not just over our lives, but for safeguarding these files.
According to Sami, very few people knew about their activities, adding that they had thought the revolution would end in just a few months.
لا طبعا أشخاص محدودين جدا هم الذين كانوا يعرفون بطبيعة ما يحصل بينهم.
Only a very limited number of people knew about what we were doing. At the beginning, we didn't plan to compile such dangerous files and smuggle them out of the country. We thought the revolution might end in 3 or 4 months, like in Egypt and Tunisia. We wanted to avoid the tragedy of 1982, where people went missing and no one knew whether they were dead or alive. So we decided to keep these images and, after the revolution, release them to the public so people could learn the fate of their loved ones, whether they'd been martyred or were missing.
نعلنها لشعبنا الكريم لكي يعرف الناس مصير أحبابهم من كان منهم قد استشهد ومن كان مفقودا حقيقة.
Sami goes on to describe how these snapshots captured the horror of torture, highlighting what stood out the most.
الحقيقة لا أستطيع أن أقول عن صورة إنها بشعة.
Honestly, I cannot describe any of these images as horrifying. These are our martyrs, our people. We do not want to violate their privacy. You're talking about the horror of torture, the gruesome methods used. I cannot bring myself to compare or say one image shows more suffering or violation than another. However, what stood out was that some security branches consistently displayed severe starvation of detainees and victims, or instances where their eyes were gouged out. The thought of someone's eyes being ripped out while they were likely still alive, given the blood splatter around the eye socket, is haunting. I don't think you could ever see or experience a more horrible feeling than this.
هذا الأمر يعني عندما تتصوره لا أعتقد أنك يمكن أن ترى أو تعيش إحساس أبشع من هذا.
So who's the true hero here? According to Sami, it's neither him nor Caesar.
مهما كانت الطريقة التي ينظر.
I just want to correct one thing. No matter how others perceive us, we are certainly not heroes. The true hero is the one who is martyred. It is the person in this photo. It is this file. This file is the hero. The real heroes are the mothers who lost their children, the wives and children who lost their fathers. They are the true heroes. We are merely carriers, messengers of justice, nothing more. At every stage of our work, the team would grow or shrink in number depending on the requirements of the phase, the location, and the goal we aim to achieve.
According to Sami, there are several terms which he says are often confused when it comes to the Caesar files, adding that the Caesar Act was a byproduct of the files.
ابتداء أنا أريد التفريق بين مسميين.
First, I want to clarify the distinction between two terms that are often confused. The Caesar file pertains to victims who were killed in Syrian regime prisons under torture. These were defenseless civilians subjected to the most brutal forms of torture. The file itself has two other parts. The second part includes what the regime labels as terrorists, referring to people massacred in their homes, including children under the age of 10. And elderly individuals over 80. Yet the regime shamelessly labels these files as the elimination of a terrorist group, often claiming it consisted of 15 to 20 individuals. When you look at the photos, you see grandparents, parents and small children. Shamelessly, the regime writes, the elimination of a terrorist group. This is the second part of the file. The third part is a collection of information that has not been revealed or discussed in the media. Together, these parts make up the Caesar file, which documents crimes against humanity and acts of genocide. These crimes do not expire with time, and no one has the right to waive accountability for the perpetrators. As for the Caesar Act, it's a byproduct of the file and a result of efforts by Syrian organizations in the United States. Our role in that effort was limited to a few visits to the US, where we met with members of Congress and other organizations and explained the atrocities committed by the regime against Syrian civilians. The distinction is clear. The file is purely Syrian, while the law is purely American. The overlap lies in their shared aim of protecting Syrian civilians and limiting the regime's ability to kill more of them.
الحد من قدرة النظام على أن يقتل أكثر من السوريين.
And describing the harrowing scenes he saw at regime prisons and centers, Sami says al-Assad was running a killing factory.
What I can say is that the file I saw and compiled includes images of children. Yes, children. Why were they detained and killed? I cannot speculate. The brutality depicted in the photos is beyond imagination. It's unfathomable how the guards could carry out such horrific acts. What we've seen recently, with detainees being freed after prisons were opened by locals or authorities, represents perhaps the penultimate stage of producing these corpses, the victims of Bashar al-Assad's machinery of death. Al-Assad is running a factory of killing. The final stage is represented by the Caesar photos, where we noticed even the bodies were sometimes wrapped in nylon bags. Before that, during the initial detention and torture stages, I think what we have in the Caesar file is a very small part of the crimes that the regime was committing. The Caesar file only covers detention centers and prisons in Damascus, not all of Syria. It also spans a limited time period, from May 2011 to around August or September 2013.
تقريبا من الشهر الخامس 2011 إلى الثامن أو التاسع 2013.
While Bashar al-Assad fled to Russia, Sami calls for having the ousted president tried in Damascus by Syrian judges under a fair and just system in what he calls a free Syria.
عندما كنا نطالب
When we were calling for Bashar al-Assad to be brought to The Hague, Syria was occupied by his regime and his allies. It was a republic of fear. Despite the challenges, such as Russian and Chinese vetoes, we persisted. We turned to national courts in European Union countries that operate under universal jurisdiction. However, today Syria is free. Bashar al-Assad should be tried in Damascus by Syrian judges under a fair and just Syrian legal system. Justice should not stop with al-Assad. All of those who committed violations, whether physical or moral, must be held accountable. This must happen in Damascus as a symbol of justice for a free people who sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives.
Sami reveals to Al-Arabiya not all of those involved in the described crimes were only military personnel, but included doctors and others working in the medical field.
We have information about certain officers and staff working inside these prisons, including documents showing the involvement of a doctor who examined the victims' bodies and issued falsified medical reports. These reports often claimed victims died of a sudden cardiac arrest or respiratory failure during interrogation, even when their bodies bore horrific injuries such as missing eyes, severe burns, or extreme emaciation. We also have names and photos of some individuals involved, including those working in medical services in Damascus hospitals. Not all of them are military personnel.
يعني هم ليسوا عسكريين وإنما هم يعملون في الخدمات الطبية في مشافي دمشق.
During the interview, Sami calls on Syrians not to discard any documents they may find after the fall of the government. According to him, these could be used as evidence of the atrocities committed by the regime.
اليوم نحن نشاهد في دمشق وفي
What we see today in Damascus and other cities, how the archives are mishandled, is an affront to the victims' rights. We've seen documents carelessly discarded on the streets in Damascus and elsewhere. I want to remind Syrians that when Russia intervened in 2015, the revolution stagnated and the world turned away. The Caesar file isolated al-Assad economically and politically at a time when he was being rehabilitated internationally. Without it, he might now be walking red carpets in world capitals. So I urge Syrians not to discard these documents. They are critical. We have a team on the ground in Syria to collect what they can of these documents to aid us in the transitional justice period. How can you achieve transitional justice without accountability? Accountability requires evidence, and evidence depends on documents and accurate archiving. Documents handled carelessly may not be admissible in court.
ليست كل الوثائق يمكن قبولها في المحكمة إذا تم التعامل معها بهذه الطرق التي نشاهدها على الشاشات يوميا. هذا السؤال أستطيع أن أجيب عليه.
The chaos we see today in how documents are treated mirrors the disorganized release of detainees. Many of these detainees have spent decades in prison and are in poor health. Their treatment and the handling of documents must be systematic, as they are both part of the evidence. Additionally, any employee still serving under Bashar al-Assad's regime could tamper with or destroy critical documents. I urge people to be vigilant and ensure these individuals are not allowed to manipulate or destroy evidence.
فكيف نترك هؤلاء يتلفون هذه الوثائق ونعطيهم الوقت؟
Sami also reveals to Al-Arabiya that public hospitals in Syria turned into human slaughterhouses under the regime during the revolution years.
في سوريا جميع مؤسسات الدولة مهما كانت صفتها هي مؤسسات أمنية أو تخضع لإشراف أمني مباشر.
In Syria, all state institutions, regardless of their official function, are either security institutions or operate under direct security oversight. For instance, even at the level of municipal councils, there's a security officer monitoring every decision in detail. Public hospitals in Syria, which turned into human slaughterhouses during the revolution, became places where victims' and injured individuals' rights were grossly violated. While I cannot cite specific cases at this moment, this applies even more to branches of the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, which routinely submitted reports to security agencies. These branches were not serving as political organizations, but as surveillance entities.
And moving on to the Caesar Act, Sami reiterates that his team's efforts were not focused on passing the law. Instead, they were able to prevent the regime from whitewashing its image.
I
want to reiterate that our team's efforts were not focused on passing the Caesar Act. That was the work of Syrian organizations, achieved through a collective effort by many groups. Our real contribution lies in the emotional and legal impact that prevented the regime from rehabilitating its image. This regime is criminal, and the genuine legal testimonies we provided to institutions like the German public prosecutor and France's war crimes unit were instrumental. These testimonies formed the foundation of the legal cases heard in European courts. Unlike testimonies before parliaments, congresses or political groups, these legal testimonies are enduring and impactful. Media testimonies may gain attention temporarily, but they do not hold the same weight or influence policy changes.
He also clarifies that the Caesar Act does not prevent the imports of essential goods, such as medication, as the regime had claimed.
Let me remind Syrians that the Caesar sanctions apply to all of Syria, not just areas under the regime's control. The dire situation in regime-controlled areas is not due to sanctions, but to the regime's corruption and economic mismanagement. The regime blames the Caesar Act for the lack of medicine and fuel, but this is untrue. The Caesar Act does not prevent the import of essential goods such as medicines, food, agricultural equipment, fertilizers or seeds. Its purpose is to limit the regime's ability to sustain its military machine used to kill Syrians. For example, the Deir Ali power plant south of Damascus receives Egyptian gas through a pipeline via Jordan, so fuel imports by sea are unnecessary. The regime's claims blaming sanctions are entirely false.
While the photos collected over the years played a significant role in holding the regime accountable, Sami reveals his and Caesar's original intentions.
We
collected these photos intending to share them with the Syrian people after the regime fell. At the time, we thought this would take only a few months. When we began, we had no plans to take these documents out of the country. Therefore, we never communicated with anyone outside the country or with individuals involved in legal affairs within the country, nor with those engaged in political affairs.
Sami explains the sensitive nature of handling the Caesar files, emphasizing the need to protect families from unnecessary trauma.
We believed
that handling the Caesar file required a professional and legal approach, not a sensational or haphazard one aimed directly at families in Syria. Many families who lost loved ones cannot even recognize their relatives in these images. For instance, I kept photos of friends for years without realizing they were people I knew. Only later did I discover that they were friends who had been tortured and killed. Due to the extreme disfigurement of the victims, it's neither appropriate nor humane to distribute these images indiscriminately. Showing such photos to families could cause repeated psychological trauma, especially if the person is not their missing relative. Similarly, families who recognize their loved ones may be unable to process the horror of what they see. This requires careful handling using legal and technical methods.
هذا الأمر يجب أن يعامل بحكمة وعبر وسائل تقنية وقانونية دقيقة.
Sami stresses that the regime's remnants still pose a challenge and that achieving freedom for Syria requires justice and accountability.
الذي سقط حتى الآن في رأينا هو بشار الأسد.
In our view, what has fallen so far is Bashar al-Assad himself, but his regime is not fully gone yet. There's still much work ahead of us to fully bring it down and be able to say that Syria has become free and that the last remnants of this regime, those who committed crimes against the Syrian people, have been eliminated. We are now part of Syrian human rights organizations operating in the European Union and the United States. Our work is ongoing and extends beyond the Caesar file. We've collected numerous other documents from inside Syria and expect to obtain more soon.
الوثائق التي حصلنا عليها حتى الآن من الداخل السوري والتي ربما نحصل عليها في القريب.
Sami reveals new findings, including previously unknown detention centers, as part of his team's ongoing work to uncover regime atrocities. He also describes how living under the regime felt like being in a prison where any interaction could lead to detention, torture, or worse.
We've obtained a portion of these documents which contain critical and dangerous information. We might acquire additional files that will complement our work, which goes far beyond the Caesar file. The Caesar file covers a limited period and geographic area. Today we've identified previously unknown detention centers in Damascus, whose existence had never been publicly acknowledged. I can't claim certainty, but I can say that we have documents identifying prisons in Damascus whose names were previously unknown.
لا أستطيع أن أدعي ذلك ولكن
We're familiar with facilities like the Air Force Intelligence Branch, the Political Security Prison, Adra Prison and Saydnaya Prison. Saydnaya in particular can be considered the Syrian Bastille, but this regime's crimes extend far beyond detaining people in conventional cells. For me, all of Syria was a prison. Walking the streets felt no different from being in a jail cell. While prisons might have low ceilings and locked doors, even those walking the streets were potential detainees at any moment. You might get into a taxi for a short trip, intending to pay 50 liras to reach your destination, but a casual or naive comment to the driver could redirect your path to a security branch or patrol station where you would pay for that ride with the rest of your life. I believe there's still much to uncover.
لكي تدفع ثمن هذا المشوار بقية عمرك.
While Syrians all over the world have been celebrating the fall of al-Assad, Sami warns of what's to come if people truly believe that the entire regime had been toppled within days.
اسمح لي أن أقول أنه من السذاجة أن نعتقد بأن نظام عمره 60 عاما يمكن أن نقول إننا قضينا عليه في 6 أيام.
Let me say this. It's naive to think that a regime that has lasted for 60 years can be toppled in 6 days. Anyone making such claims insults the intelligence of the Syrian people. We've endured 3 generations under this oppressive and criminal regime, and every day we uncover thousands of documents revealing the extent of its crimes and the sadistic pleasure some of its operatives took in torturing and killing Syrians. Neither I nor anyone else can claim that this regime has truly fallen just because its head fled, or others raised a new flag. A green flag doesn't wipe the blood off anyone's hands. I cannot continue living in Syria while next door resides a man who reeks of bloodshed. I don't want to dampen the joy of our people in Syria, but I emphasize that to sustain this joy and stability, we must work towards transitional justice and accountability, not reconciliation. Reconciliation can be reserved for personal disputes and minor matters. No one reconciles over the blood of the people.
المصالحة في الخلافات الشخصية والأمور الصغيرة. لا أحد يصالح على دماء الناس. لا أقول أن هناك عمل مقصود لإعادة إنتاج النظام أبدا وإنما
I'm not suggesting there's a deliberate effort to revive the regime, but I caution our people in Syria and the heroes who expanded the Green Zone from Idlib, the capital of the revolution in recent years, to the south of Syria and Damascus itself. We must remain vigilant to ensure no one undermines our victory. We must systematically and meticulously work toward holding all perpetrators of violations accountable. This requires securing documents and removing former regime employees from positions of influence, regardless of the institutions they serve. However, I'm realistic. I can't advocate for expelling everyone from their positions. That's not feasible. But I urge our people on the ground and the heroes who liberated Damascus and other cities to prioritize this issue and handle it carefully.
على أن هذا أمر مهم يجب أن ينتبهوا إليه.
Finally, Sami reflects on his wish to have been in Damascus the day it was liberated.
أتمنى لو كنت في دمشق.
I wish I could have been in Damascus the day it was liberated. I wish I could have been in my hometown of Al-Tal on that day. I hope this moment comes very soon.
وأرجو أن يكون هذا الأمر قريبا جدا.
That was Sami's account, offering a rare and critical perspective into his journey and ongoing pursuit of justice for the victims of the al-Assad regime. As the world watches and everyone waits to see what the future holds for this Middle Eastern country after an 11-year civil war. From Al-Arabiya News, I'm Joanne Syria. Thank you for watching.
At Al-Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al-Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al-Arabiya News. I'm your host, Micheál Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No. The Democratic Party lost its way. They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, you know, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake because Harris, well, a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2020, in 2019 she failed, 2020 she failed again in 2024. The analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. They got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy. Yeah,
the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid it $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at 11 to 12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't mess around.
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans, AAA players, that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government, because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody will forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work because my family, is American and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day. And this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he sacked or he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds, because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules. They never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I point that out is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you ride against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the Supreme Leader goes, oh my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there, squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding, I want to work out and be part of the reciprocal tariff act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's, excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. No, we want to stop. Because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the supreme leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal, you can't use their courts. A good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the US, the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it via a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great, it depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I'd pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because, remember, they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the supreme leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So again, squeezing the supreme leader's head there is good. And it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the supreme leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just, somebody has to stop this.
Exactly, and on a human level, but as well as
obviously
markets. So it affects the bread and butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether Trump's successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's, you know, all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing. So we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach 200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think, and you don't have to do this, I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. You know, Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but you know, what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector, you're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. It's, you know, in terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a Moser, a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support... The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no
I'll pay a pretty penny for an O'Leary band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So they don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
like on Shark Tank.
Yeah, the whole thing is, you know, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And you know, my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, you know, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
At Al-Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al-Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al-Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and with the holiday season upon us, we've decided to take a look back at some of the highlights from the last few weeks. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President-elect Donald Trump is pledging big tariffs on the United States' three largest trading partners, namely Canada, Mexico and China, where he plans to impose a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico until they clamp down on drugs and migration. Well, Beijing has responded, saying that they remain open to dialogue with the United States. Canada, meanwhile, says it is, quote, essential to the US energy supply. Well, for more, we're joined now by the Canadian-American businessman and Shark Tank investor Kevin O'Leary. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again here on Al-Arabiya News. I'm assuming you're not particularly surprised because on the campaign trail, after all, Donald Trump said that his favourite word in the English language was none other than tariffs.
I'm not surprised, actually. Security at the border is not just a Mexican-U.S. issue, it's a Canadian-U.S. issue. And for a long time in previous administrations, going back as far as the NORAD agreements, the U.S. has wanted Canada to pay its fair share, as they like to say, to secure the northern border against what was once the USSR and now Russia. So they concern themselves with tying that up. Now, in Trump's case, these tariffs are all about pre-inauguration negotiation, right? Even with NATO, just visited Miami Beach recently. All of this is positioning towards what's going to be the negotiation between Canada and the U.S. around the Mexican-Canadian deal. It's an extension of NAFTA. Most people remember it as that, but this will be the third time it's negotiated. And this is a starting position. What complicates the situation right now is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, had a 2-hour conversation last night with Trump. However, he's on his way out. Trudeau probably isn't going to last another 7 or 8 months. And so, unfortunately, the parliamentary system is not quite like the U.S. The end game for a prime minister that's losing a majority mandate is they just throw him out. You saw it happen in England just a few months ago. It's going to happen in Canada. And the real negotiation is going to be with the head of the Conservative Party, a man named Pierre Poilievre, who's currently a private citizen, represents the opposition, but he's the person that will take on this responsibility by the time these negotiations start and Trump is president. So it's a very delicate situation. Obviously, there's no way you can put 25% tariffs on a partner like Canada, where all the food and energy and electricity and gas and oil and paper and minerals and all that stuff flow into the U.S. And so all of this is just a pre-positioning, and it's not a big surprise to anybody. It's just this unique situation where Trudeau is lame duck, and the new prime minister is not there yet.
Because that's the situation in Canada. And of course, Canada sounding extremely alarmed by the idea of a 25% tariff, saying it will have a devastating impact on workers and jobs. But it's not just in Canada that it would have a devastating impact on workers and jobs. It would also have a devastating impact on workers in the United States, wouldn't it?
Yes. You know, you have to think about all of this as not a sales tax, not a burden on the American economy at all. The real issue here, you know, sort of the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, is not Canada or Mexico or even the European countries. It's China. The U.S., in fact, Europe, I'd argue, is in an economic war with China and has been since 1999 when they came into the WTO making all these promises about playing by the rules, and they've never done that. And so IP theft, cheating, stealing, dumping of commodities in various markets, all of this has come to a head. And during the Biden administration, you know, they didn't take off the tariffs against China. It's just that Trump is now ratcheting it up to get them to the table. Most tariff deals are reciprocal. That's what the agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico is. It's a reciprocal tariff agreement. Same with Germany on automotives at 10%. But this China thing is going to DEFCON 1. It's getting really, really extreme. And I expect, rather than risk trade with the U.S., the supreme leader, who only gets to remain supreme if everybody's employed in China, will get over to the U.S. and try and work something out. And that's because Trump is just making it so difficult. And I don't think it's really going to affect the U.S. economy. There hasn't been much effect on tariffs at all. We've had a very strong economy at the consumer level, stock markets at all-time high. It was a lot of political rhetoric. The tariffs would ruin the economy. It just hasn't happened. And now we're going into the end game, or the beginning of the game, depending on which way you want to look at it. But I expect that this will really be all about China and will not have that much effect on the American economy.
So how come China got away with it seemingly lightly with a 10% hike in tariffs, when in fact Donald Trump had talked on the campaign trail about something a bit more like 60%, hadn't he?
Yeah. I mean, the whole presidential election is over and the country's operating as if Trump is already president. You don't see a lot of foreign leaders going to Washington. They're all showing up in Mar-a-Lago right now. So we only have 54 days left. We're going through a holiday season here in the U.S. Trump has almost picked his entire cabinet. I mean, it's incredible at the pace at which he's done this. And most people like the picks. There's a couple of controversial ones. But Trump knows he only has 24 months in which he has a majority mandate, because there are going to be midterm elections, and usually the House flips then, and you don't have as much power. So he's going to try and ram all this stuff through in the next 2 years, and he's got a mandate. He won an incredible, no other way to describe it, than a landslide. I mean, he decimated the Democrats in every swing state and then some, and even won the popular vote. So he's not waiting around to debate anything with the White House or any Democrats. He's just firing up the engines, and he's going to plow right on through town.
The reason given for singling out China relates to the drug fentanyl. And I just want to ask you whether you think that's first of all, is that the real reason? And then I also want to ask you, as an extension of that question, why this is such a serious issue in the United States?
Well, fentanyl's been an issue. Opioid addiction, huge issue. Porous border, Mexico, drug cartels, murders in small American towns. All of this has made headlines in the last 4 months. But it's not just fentanyl. The dumping of commodities in the U.S. market and the lack of IP protection, spyware in the form of TikTok, scheduled to shut down January 19th at midnight, all of this is boiling and simmering just below the surface. And so, you know, this is really about how tough Trump is going to get on China. And he really wants, you know, the Canadians to make sure that once he seals off the Mexican border, Canada is not a problem. So that's what he told Trudeau last night. Trudeau won't be around to execute on that, but the message is clear to the Canadian people. It's not going to be business as usual. They're going to have to spend more money on maintaining that border and not making it porous, because there's been evidence of illegal immigration coming through the Canadian border in Quebec or in British Columbia, all of these places, and Alberta as well. That's a very big open border, so it's going to have a lot more patrolling. Luckily, there's a lot of technology, a lot of drone technology, you know, monitoring technology, infrared technology, satellite technology. This just has to be executed by the Canadians, and it's going to be made a priority. It's all going to happen. But fentanyl is, yes, important, but just one issue. And so Trump is just taking an attitude. Border means both borders. It means Canada and it means Mexico.
Sure, and I'm just wondering, I mean, just looking at the Donald Trump lineup for his inner circle, and of course Elon Musk is a big part of that. I mean, whether you see him having some involvement in this idea about imposing these tariffs, and also what you think he's going to bring to the table, just generally speaking, with regards to government efficiency.
Well, there's never been anything quite like Doge, if that's what you want to make reference to, because it's worth talking about. Two private citizens that have incredible executional skills, particularly in the case of, you know, what Elon Musk has achieved. He has a lot of respect within bipartisan votership. I mean, you know, if you want to start saving money in government, it's not just a Republican or Democratic issue. And they want to talk about erasing trillions of dollars of waste. Most people know the federal government's full of waste. It's fat, it's sassy, it's never been controlled, deficits have never been higher. Nothing wrong with that. So you're getting Trump 2.0, which looks like he'll be a little bit more stable, plus you're adding a whole dash of Doge to make the whole thing more interesting. Most people are going to cut a pretty broad swath for this administration for an extended period of time, at least 2 years, to see what they can achieve. So there's a fair amount of euphoria here in the U.S. right now amongst business leaders. Taxes will remain stable. The regulatory environment will be stripped away. Pretty well everything Biden tried to do will be erased. That's just the nature of presidential politics. We're going to be lighting up natural gas export, LNG, almost immediately. Executive orders will become flying out of the White House on the 21st of January. A lot of change coming. And it really was two different divisions in terms of the vision for each way the country was going to be run between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the voting constituency, by a landslide choice, decided they would go back the Trump way of doing things. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and just lastly, just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, we have had a pretty decent peek behind the curtain with regards to what Trump 2.0 is going to look like. We've been talking about tariffs, we've been talking about Doge. I mean, what are your sort of forecasts? What are your predictions as to where things head to with regards to job creation and trade deficit reduction under the new Trump presidency?
Well, you can see it now. One index of the optimism is the stock market itself hitting new highs, but there's also a lot of optimism in small business in America, which represents about 62% of job creation. They're waiting to see all the regulations peeled away. The Trump picks for cabinet positions are different than Trump 1.0. Most of these people are seasoned veterans. They're going to be around for the full 4 years. It's not going to be as much volatility. Trump is thinking legacy at this point. This is definitely his last election other than the midterms, but he wants to leave the country better than he found it. Every president does. And he is building a platform within the White House that's going to be remarkably different than the last time. There was a lot of volatility, if you want to use that word. But even he has said, look, I'm not going to make the same mistakes. I'm not going to hire people that don't know what they're doing. I'm going to get veterans that understand the system. He's done that in commerce. He's done that in Treasury. Health is a little controversial with Kennedy, but I actually think Kennedy will make it through the gauntlet because he has a lot of interesting ideas about food choices, of which I'm a huge advocate of. I'm just one person. But the whole idea is 2.0 is a more seasoned Trump, a more stable Trump, a more experienced Trump with an added dash of Doge. So a little extra cleaning fluid, if you want to call it that.
Sure. And just lastly, because I said that was the last question, but I actually have one more question to you, because I think last time you came on our channel, you talked about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin approaching the 100,000 mark, as sort of slowly back and forth a little bit, around the 93,000 mark today. But I'm just wondering whether you think the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration's got grand plans to regulate, or what you think they're going to change with regards to cryptocurrency regulation.
Yeah, when I last talked to you, Bitcoin was trading around 60, and it's now around 90. So a huge increase. The optimism around settling the regulatory environment around crypto in the United States and digital payment systems. Gensler's on his way out. We're talking about getting a crypto czar. CFTC, which is the commodities regulator, has been rumored to get more power around things like, is Ethereum a commodity or a security? All these things are going to get resolved. There's a stablecoin act floating around Congress right now to make the American dollar the de facto trading system for digital currency. All of this stuff is coming in the first 24 months. And so that's why you're seeing these markets so optimistic. The granddaddy digital currency, of course, is Bitcoin. It's the one that institutions want. And as soon as it's regulated and the lawsuits go away from the exchanges, SEC is suing Coinbase, the U.S.'s largest exchange, things will settle down, and you'll find 1 to 3% allocations institutionally, which will add another $1 trillion worth of demand. And so I think crypto is probably a pretty good bet. And certainly within our portfolios, we've added to it, and we're doing some rebalancing because no one saw this increase in such a short period of time with Bitcoin. I mean, if your mandate is you're only allowed to have 20% in crypto and no more than 5% in any one position, you've blown out the walls with what's occurred with Bitcoin. So we have had to do some rebalancing. But that's why you've seen the price peel back a little bit. I'm not the only person in that situation. It's happening all around the world.
OK, well, that really was the last question. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again here. Kevin O'Leary, thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Well, the US President-elect Donald Trump's tariff threats against Canada, Mexico and China have shaken up the currency markets. The dollar jumped as much as 2.3% against the Mexican peso. It rose 0.7% against the Canadian dollar. And on the Chinese side, the yuan was up just by 0.1% in offshore trading. Well, let's get some more analysis now. We can speak to Ambassador John Verrineau, who was a trade negotiator under President George W. Bush. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Obviously, tariffs are one way of the US defending its economy, but it also has implications for US consumers, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The evidence suggests, and many studies have been done that show that consumers, U.S. consumers, are paying a large portion of the tariffs that were put in place since 2018.
So what you're saying is that companies would typically pass on this additional cost to consumers by simply raising prices?
Yes, it can vary depending on the leverage between the importer and the exporter, of course. But for the most part, U.S. consumers are paying for these tariffs.
And just casting our minds back to the year 2018, when Donald Trump was last in office, and there were more tariffs during that administration. I mean, what happened then? Were there retaliatory tariffs put in place against the United States?
Yes, every action has a reaction, of course. So when the U.S. put tariffs in place, other countries, including China, put tariffs in place in response to that. And I would expect the same reaction this time from our trading partners.
But back then, did they have a detrimental effect, those retaliatory tariffs, on U.S. exporters, on job creation? What was the fallout?
Yeah, The economic studies have shown that U.S. exports were hurt in various markets. The U.S. Put in place a special subsidy program to help U.S. soybean farmers, for instance, who lost market share in China. So these interventions through tariffs have tremendous knock-on effects throughout the economy, which is why, at least until recent years, there was a tremendous effort over the previous 80 years to reduce, if not eliminate, tariffs. So they have a lot of knock-on effects throughout the economy.
And in terms of achieving the desired effect, which, according to the Trump administration, is to crack down on drugs and illegal migration, do you think they're likely to work this time? Well,
Illegal drugs and illegal immigration are very complex problems. I think the president-elect is correct to want to reduce illegal flows across the border of both, but there's also a demand side of that problem of drugs, and I would like to see the president-elect announce what he plans to do to help reduce demand among U.S. users and help those who are addicted to these drugs, in addition to efforts to try to stem the flow across borders. But addressing only the supply side has proven over time not to be sufficient. You definitely have to address the demand side. And then secondly, there's a question of whether tariffs are the appropriate tool to be using to address these problems. Historically, trade agreements have been about trade and trade alone, and have not included these other issues, however important they are. But there are other channels and other remedies available to the government and to work with other governments to address those that should be used instead of tariffs as the only solution. But as the president-elect likes to describe himself as tariff man, tariffs is his immediate go-to tool for any sort of problem.
Okay, so let's just look at this from the point of view of who comes off worst. A 25% tariff on all products that enter the United States from Mexico and Canada. Obviously, this is going to have a knock-on effect. We've talked about tit-for-tat tariffs. Who comes off worse out of this, the United States or Mexico and Canada?
Well, I think it's hard to say. I think both are losers, at a time when, the president-elect won in no small part because of his focus on inflation and U.S. voters' concerns about inflation. Even though inflation rates have declined, prices are much higher now. And now we're going to see 25% increase in a lot of lumber products, for instance, from Canada that are used in U.S. housing. So I think Canadian exporters will suffer, and U.S. consumers and home buyers will suffer.
But do you think any of this is actually really going to happen? Or do you think this is part of a negotiating technique, some posturing ahead of some talks on how perhaps trading arrangements can be changed? What do you think the strategy is here?
Well, I think we'll see both. I mean, some of it is no doubt a negotiation, but I do believe that the president-elect believes tariffs are good for America. So I don't think it is purely a negotiating tactic, although that's part of it. But negotiations have to be successful, and in order to eliminate these tariffs, if it is an opening gambit. And countries, frankly, don't like to be bullied. And when I think there are problems that are at the borders with Mexico and Canada that can be solved and should be solved. But I'm not sure that it sets the correct tone for negotiations if you start with announcing on social media plans to take unilateral action of this magnitude.
And obviously, lots of countries have reacted to this news, well, in particular, Canada, Mexico and China, the countries concerned. I mean, what struck you about the sort of reaction that we've heard from them? Do you get the impression that, from what they're saying, these tariffs might have the desired effect, whatever that may be?
Well, these are complex problems of, illegal drug importation and illegal immigration in the U.S. These are very complex problems that people have been working on for a long time. So redoubling those efforts, I think, is a very good thing. But I think to the extent that tariffs will stay in place until these complex problems are solved would suggest that these tariffs are going to be in place for a long time, because these are vexing problems that have been around and will continue to be around. But as far as the initial reaction from both Canada and Mexico and their trade officials and government officials, I think, they are understandable. They're trying to be, restrained in their response, given the stakes. And they are trying, I think, at least in their initial statements, to temper their, at least the public discussion of these, although I suspect in private there must be great dislike of the approach that has been taken in this unilateral faction.
You're quoted in the Washington Post today as saying the following: when the United States imposes import taxes on foreign goods, other countries will hit back. We've talked a bit about retaliatory tariffs already, but do you think we are here on the brink of a full-blown trade war?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, I hope not, but every action has a reaction, and negotiations, everyone likes to negotiate from a position of strength. That's understandable. That's good negotiating tactics. But no one likes to be bullied either. So you could see, a mood among negotiators among the countries where it's a very unwelcoming and challenging environment to reach a negotiation, because neither side feels they have the space to agree to something without looking domestically like they were bullied into something. And, in China, for instance, there's a history of the Opium Wars, and I'm sure it's not lost on some Chinese that they are being now threatened with these tariffs in response to an illegal drug use at a time when many in China still remember the Opium Wars, where their ports were bombed because they would not accept opium from Western sources.
And obviously looking at China in the year 2024, with this threat of a 10% additional tariff being placed on the country, I mean, it's not 100% clear, is it, what President-elect Donald Trump has in mind with regards to this additional 10%. I mean, what do you think his options are?
Well, in the campaign, as you know, he threatened tariffs of up to 60%. So I think some reaction to the 10% may be welcome news that 10 is better than 60%. But I think that would be it would be imprudent to assume that this is the end of the threats of increases to tariffs on goods from China.
Okay, and of course the Chinese embassy in Washington hitting out about these latest tariffs. They say that there will be losers on all sides if there is a trade war. Are they right?
Yes, absolutely. It's why the Bretton Woods agreements in World War II, following World War II, there was a great effort through the WTO and bilateral efforts to reduce tariffs, because they have proven to be very unhelpful interventions in the economy that ultimately hurt consumers, especially low-income consumers, and create opportunities for crony capitalism, where friends of the government in power get special dispensation and relief from tariffs, and others who are less politically favored are hurt. So the record is quite clear that these tariff interventions at the end of the day are far more hurtful than helpful.
And just lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning, you were a trade negotiator under President George W. Bush. How unprecedented is all of this, the imposition of tariffs or the threat of tariffs at the beginning of a presidential term? Or is this part of the political cycle? Is this just the sort of thing that world leaders do to sort of make their mark when they take up the reins of power? What are your thoughts?
Well, nothing is new under the sun. So there have been periods, at least in the U.S., which I'm more familiar with our own history, is, turn of the century, 1900s. There were very steep tariffs. There was a belief that tariffs were good, but that was proven through years and years of evidence that they're not helpful. They are helpful to a minority of companies that are politically favored, but harmful to the vast majority of consumers and the vast majority of other producers who don't enjoy political favoritism. So this is not new, but it's been about 100 years since these notions that tariffs are a good thing have been in the minds of those in power. So it's not new, and I suspect we will relearn old lessons of history, but that seems to be the nature of the human project.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate your time today, Ambassador John Verner. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Now, just to remind you, on the 23rd of November 2006, the former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by a cup of tea at a London hotel. Well, on his deathbed, he blamed the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, Litvinenko, who had worked for the Soviet KGB and its successor, the FSB, fell out of favor with the Russian authorities after allegedly refusing to kill the oligarch Boris Berezovsky. Well, arrested multiple times, he fled Moscow in the year 2000 and sought asylum in the United Kingdom, where he became one of Putin's most vocal critics. Well, the 18th anniversary of his death was marked during the course of the weekend. Well, we can cross now to London and speak to Marina Litvinenko, the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed almost exactly 18 years ago. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been 18 years since your husband was killed. Just tell us, first of all, how did you mark that anniversary?
You said it's 18 years since my husband was killed here in London, and I think it was mostly one of the first serious attack outside of Russia and killing enemies or oppositioner of Putin. But now in 18 years, we have more and more people who've been killed or died because they've been against of Vladimir Putin. This was a very quiet day for two of us, for me and for our son, Anatoly. And we went to cemetery and just tried to remember my husband and his father as a very good man. And I can't believe it's soon almost 20 years since he died.
Indeed, it doesn't feel like so very long ago that we were covering that story in the media. Of course, you live in London and you continue to speak out against President Vladimir Putin, whom your husband blamed for his death before he actually died from his poisoning. Just tell us a little bit about the sort of activities and the kind of activism you're engaged in.
It was even not activism. I think it was my right to understand who killed my husband. And it was not possible to bring this case to the proper court because people who was named as a first suspect were in Russia. And Putin immediately refused to extradite them to UK. And of course, they didn't want to go themselves. And only way was to bring this case to inquest or to public inquiry. And it did happen in 10 years after my husband, Alexander Litvinenko, was killed in 2015, and only in 2016 we had a verdict. It means all these 10 years, I didn't feel myself as an activist, but as a person who fights the truth and to understand how president of a big country as Russia might be a criminal. He was pointed in a public inquiry report. He was not named as a person who killed my husband, but he's definitely responsible for my husband's death and for use of radioactive material, polonium-210. And it's not a proper, maybe, verdict, but one day after what Putin done during this almost 25 years being as a head of Russia, this will be one part of this huge case against Vladimir Putin.
And before he was poisoned, your husband said that Putin will start a war, millions of people will die, he said. He also said words to the effect that this monster, talking about Vladimir Putin, must be stopped. I'm just wondering what it was about that angered Moscow so much, and what you think he envisaged happening as the years went by.
It was a lot of things what might or irritated or became angry with my husband, but Sasha, my husband, always said, this is people that are criminals. They don't care about state. They don't care about people in Russia. They mostly care about money and power and controlling this criminal business. And if you started to do something what this business might be cut or compromise, they might kill you. And this is exactly what happened to any other people as my husband, Alexander Litvinenko, when they tried to stop. I can't call this as even corruption. This was like an international crime. They tried to corrupt people all around the world. And this is, we see what is happening now during this war against Ukraine. How is this everything difficult? And knowledge of my husband as a former security officer was very important here in UK or in Europe to explain this. And I think it became as a very special point why he was killed at the end.
And obviously predicting a war in which millions of people were killed, which were the words that your husband used before he was died. Do you think he envisaged that the day that would come, that the situation we're in now, that there would be a war between Russia and Ukraine involving the West to a significant degree?
It's very difficult to make any prognosis. Only things what I always try to say, Putin tried to bring as many countries involved in this situation. And countries as the United States, United Kingdom, and European Union, they just too long waiting for reaction. If it's all happened in 2022, when Putin just started this war and stopped him and provide all weapons what Ukraine was needed, it would be finished much sooner. And not so many people might died, and so many children might died. And now we can see how more and more people dying in this war. And this situation would be worse if, again, European countries and United States will started to calm down Putin or trust him for what he is saying. Putin must be stopped. And Ukraine, what is fighting already for almost 3 years, need to be supported, and it's not going to be any third world war if it would be finished sooner as possible.
But of course, the Biden administration and it seems the United Kingdom as well have given Ukraine permission to use some very significant weaponry in the last couple of weeks. And that's obviously angered Russia. President Putin has issued some pretty chilling warnings about where things could head to from here. How seriously do you think we should take those warnings?
But this was from a very beginning. When this war started, Putin tried to frighten all leaders, saying it's my game. I'm fighting against Ukrainian Nazis, how he called them. But of course, we know it was not any Nazis. And he already said you might use nuclear weapon because we already developed a lot of new missiles, but it never happened. Even after Ukrainian army just went to Russian territory and now almost 3 months staying in this part of Russia. And this has never happened. Why now you have to believe Putin will use this nuclear weapon after what never happened before? I think, he tried to push leaders, he tried to push ordinary people and make them feel frightening to say this because his own situation is not perfect. Russian economy was not prepared for this long war. They might do this for a few months, maybe for 1 year. But even they try to change economy to military type, again, it doesn't work properly. Why they always need a new people or soldiers from, now we know, from North Korea, some of them from Africa, because they don't have enough people in a front line first, and they don't have enough people working in the factories. And this is a real situation of Russia. And for Putin, it's better maybe to stop this war, but in a position what suits him. He doesn't want to give up territory what he already occupied. He even wants to take a bigger part, and he needs to present to all Russian people inside of Russia it's his victory. And to make this, he needs to stop UK, United States, France to supply Ukraine with these weapons.
So is that how you see things heading to from here? Do you think a negotiated settlement is the most likely way forward for Ukraine? And I also want to ask you what you think the advent of Donald Trump on the scene would mean for such a negotiated settlement.
Again, I would be the last person who will try to predict what Donald Trump will do, because it's, of course, his decision might be last, but it's every time depending to his advisors. And we need to see who's around him and what kind of advice he might receive. And he obviously less politician, but more businessman. And he will calculate what's a way would be more profited for him. And this is all my answers for now. We don't know what situation might be preferent for Donald Trump.
You've said that President Putin wants to sow fear and disunity amongst Ukraine's allies. How much success do you think he's having in this regard?
Again, from very beginning, it was not real allies. It was not real consolidation of countries against this war. And this is what was not happened. This was supposed to be finished just in a few months after this all consolidation. This is always calculation. How long Ukraine will survive, or Putin will use nuclear weapon or not. And this is always delayed. But this is exactly what Putin wanted. It's his always strategy to make people or countries to be against each other, not doing work together. And now, actually, we have another very serious situation. We can call this like a proxy war. And he used some, of course not Putin personal, but the system tried to use a different type of destabilization in the different countries. No, for example, today morning we have an aircraft in Lithuania, in the Baltic countries, collapse. This was business jet, DHL. But you know, a similar situation happened in UK, but not with a jet, but with some office, when again DHL was under, I would say, attack, because parcel was just exploded. And we still don't know what happened with this jet, with DHL in Vilnius. And this is all strategy, what Putin's system tried to use against civilization, to feel people insecure, unsafe. And what I say, consolidation and union of this country against Putin as evil. I don't have another word about him, how he all doing now against all world, just to stop.
Yeah, and of course we've had the head of MI5 in the United Kingdom, the domestic intelligence agency, saying that Putin's henchmen, he says, want to cause chaos on the streets of the UK and of Europe. I mean, do you think that's something that can and will really happen?
No, it did happen, and we have some already result, and hackers attack, and some Russian hackers behind of this. What I said happened to DHL, and even hooligans. They might be locals, but they would be used by this Russian security service to destabilize this situation. Even provocative involvement to different meetings of protest. Again, this might be some trace of Russian security service. And this is, again, we're allowed to do this. It's like an illness. If you don't have a very strong treatment, immediate, maybe very, again, what I said, strong, illness will not finish. Everything what we're doing, we just a small portion, but not enough to treat this illness. Because Putin is a real illness. Because what I see now, it's like a metastase. If you don't treat cancer properly, you have a metastase in your whole body. And what he tried to do now.
What is the state of the opposition in Russia today? Because, of course, Alexei Navalny died earlier this year. Is there anything left of the opposition?
Alexei Navalny was definitely the most prominent and powerful oppositioner, but not alone. He was just the most, what I said, well-known. But opposition in Russia was destroyed many years ago. And we never, since beginning Putin in the power, we didn't have a proper opposition presenting in a parliament. This opposition might make any change. We can call this system opposition. Any other opposition was not system. They could go for protest in the streets. They might try to be elected to the local, to council or some parliaments of towns or cities, but not a bigger result opposition could achieve being in Russia. And particularly after war started in 2014, I would like to mention, with the Crimea invasion and all this activity in the east of Ukraine, Putin started to squeeze opposition more and more. And any change to do in Russia was not possible. Some people escaped, some people been arrested, some people been killed, as Alexei Navalny. This is what we all say about opposition. And now I believe any person who against the war, who disagree with what Putin is doing, is opposition. And if you still be a normal and not supporting this war, you might be this power. And now it looks like to be Russian and save your normality. It means opposition now.
The only other person in the world who probably understands the situation that you've been through, the pain you've been through, the only other parallel I can think of is Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Alexei Navalny. And I'm just wondering whether you've maintained contact with her and whether you see her having a role going forward and really carrying on the work of her husband.
This is a lot of similarity and difference. Of course, I feel so sorry for Yulia Navalny, who was very supportive to her husband, but I don't think she ever expected to be a leader of opposition. I still don't know if it's her choice or she could not say no to all supporters of Alexei Navalny. But it means she's very brave, because it's not so long since Alexei Navalny died, and her decision was almost immediate to start this new position. And again, for what I could say, it's just I wish her success, and if she would be able to consolidate people around her. But again, I don't think we all need to find any leader. You have to keep these all right things inside of you and doing even little things, but what might change something in the future. But for young people, maybe it's very important to consolidate around somebody. If there's any activities, as for example was a march of peace in Berlin and on 17th of November, again, is good. If people might find somebody who is a similar or believes to similar things, it's okay, it's good, it's right.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but I really want to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Marina Litvinenko. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, the war has cost Lebanon an estimated $8.5 billion in physical and economic damage. That's according to one estimate from the World Bank. Well, to talk to us more about this is Lebanon's Economy and Trade Minister, Amin Salam. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al-Arabiya News. Reports that we've received suggest there have been some celebrations in Beirut. Hezbollah supporters portraying the truce as being a victory for them. Is that how it feels for people in Lebanon right now? Does this feel like a victory?
Hello, and thanks for having me with you guys. Well, let me tell you, it's a very happy day for Lebanon. It's a very important and critical day for Lebanon. I wouldn't put it in the context of victory. I wouldn't put it in the context of celebration. Yes, the Hezbollah base have been driving back to their homes, to the south, driving back to their cities to check on how things are. To them, it's a joyful moment that they're going back to their villages, their houses, their areas to see what's happening, because they have been displaced in very dire conditions for a long time. But I can tell you from a political perspective, it's not yet a time to celebrate. It's not yet a time to declare victory. It's a time to really monitor and hope that this ceasefire will accomplish its full targets and will pass those 60 difficult days, leading to a longer standing stability and peace for Lebanon and for the region. This is really how we are looking at it. This is how I'm reading it from my position, especially as Minister of Economy, which is the biggest struggle in this country today.
Does it feel like a fragile ceasefire when you look at it? I mean, let's not forget the bombardment of some areas of Beirut only ended less than 24 hours ago. So I know this is a difficult question to answer, but I mean, do you see it holding?
It is a very fragile ceasefire. I mean, you could feel even to the last minute or to the last few hours before the ceasefire, Lebanon was being bombed very aggressively. I can tell you from my location where I am now, yesterday I was in my office, bombs were all over this area. I mean, we could see them, we could feel them, we could hear them, ambulances all over the streets, still massive casualties. So this ceasefire is very, very fragile. That's why I'm using the term we should monitor carefully the next 60 days, because any escalation, any mistake, any bad intention from any side can lead to the complete destruction of all the good work, all the diplomatic work that has been done to lead to this ceasefire.
Some people will be wondering, and it must have felt like a very long few weeks of Israeli bombardment, but what took so long? Why couldn't this deal have been secured sooner?
Well, I can tell you, this deal is over 3 weeks old. I mean, the basic elements of this deal were already in place. The biggest problem with this deal was that the Israeli side, first of all, asked to put France outside the equation. That was a big blow to Lebanon, and that was a big blow to the deal. But the more important one was the one that related to the sovereignty and decision of the Lebanese people, including Hezbollah as well, for Israel to feel that they can intervene and they can assess any non-compliance of the 1701, where they can intervene immediately through the sky or through the land and break the ceasefire when they see appropriate, without having the US or any other country being involved. That was a major pending element of the deal that dragged it another 2 weeks until the United States stepped in and said, I will be the one that will bear this responsibility. I will assess if there was a non-compliance or if there was a violation of 1701 or of this agreement particularly, and then we will assess what needs to be done. Now, this has been kind of camouflaged in a certain political diplomatic way within the deal, but the US managed to help us get over that article and then get the approval from the Lebanese side, followed by the approval from the Israeli side.
Okay, so Israeli forces, we understand, are going to start leaving the border area in the south during the course of the next 60 days. And I'm wondering why people think that UNIFIL and the Lebanese army are going to be able to secure that border area when they failed to do so since the year 2006. What's going to be different this time?
What is different this time is a very simple new reality that has come to play. And that is the fact that today there is an approach, a regional approach going under a Middle East agreement, if we want to call it, especially with the new U.S. administration coming into the White House, that will follow the Saudi pledge for a zero conflict region. So under a zero conflict region approach, it is expected that a country like Lebanon that has a major conflict with Israel will be one of the countries that will follow the lead of a zero conflict approach for a longer standing peace in the region. Having said that, that means today, after all what happened, Hezbollah will be working closer with the Lebanese government on solutions in Lebanon and not on escalations in Lebanon, whether it's related directly to their role as a resilience group, especially that this role will be over once there is a peace process after the ceasefire with Israel, or after there is an understanding for a long-standing peace. How that will shape up, we're still politically not there. But I think this is the only thing that changed that will give the international community today a strong reason to support the Lebanese army, contrary to what we had in the past. In the past, the Lebanese army was politically dragged into becoming weak because that was the direction in the region. That was how things were done. Today, there's a big push for the Lebanese army to be supported by the international community, to be funded by the international community, to govern and have sovereignty all over the Lebanese territory. And we see that happening. This will be the only path where Lebanon will join the zero conflict process and will witness a long-standing peace in the region.
Minister, one of your colleagues who has been extremely busy the last few weeks is, of course, the Parliament Speaker, Nabir Berri, and he has been urging the swift election of a new president of Lebanon. He says this is of the utmost importance. I think everyone agrees on that. It's been talked about for months. Do you think it can now happen?
Well, we were hoping that when all this conflict started, we should seize the opportunity to be unified, all of us Lebanese people, Lebanese parties, to really elect the president. Because everybody knows that one of the major hurdles of electing a president is internal in Lebanon. And now, what we have been through the past year, and particularly the past few months, have brought Lebanese people closer together. We have felt more unity than ever before amongst the different political parties. And I think the Speaker of the House is one of the top politicians that read opportunities and seize opportunities. And today he is a key player in the ceasefire. He sees that there is a serious opportunity now to take advantage of the positive momentum amongst the political parties, to bring them back to the parliament and to elect the president, because he knows, and we know, that the next stage which will require a head of state and a fully fledged government to negotiate and have a seat on the table in the region for the future of the Middle East, the future of Lebanon, the role of Lebanon in the Middle East. Without a head of a state, without a proper government, in place, we will always be a weak link and we will not get our best share of the deal.
Indeed, and having a fully functioning government does not mean, does it, the end of Lebanon's problems? Because for 5 years now, the country's been in financial, economic turmoil. Millions of Lebanese people are living a very difficult existence, plunged into poverty. How is the country going to rebuild? Because this is where you come into play.
Well, I mean, as you know, we've shared a lot of details, I think, in our last get-together on TV, in our last interview about the economy, the billions of dollars, the losses. I think, to answer your question in a very clear way, the only path forward is having a full government in place, reflecting confidence to the international community, particularly regaining very fast the trust of the international community by complying with all the international agreements, including 1701, the Lebanese army moving forward with its presence on the entire territory. But most importantly for the economy, I would say, and for rebuilding Lebanon, and we all know that without the international community, we will not be able to do that. We will need to very, very, very quickly go with the reforms that we have been dragging our feet on for the past few years. We should move forward with the reforms immediately. We should portray and reflect trust to the international community, particularly to the Arab world. Otherwise, it will be difficult to ask anyone for help. It will be difficult to expect that money will be poured on Lebanon to rebuild what has been destroyed and to join the future of economic growth and prosperity in the Middle East. Without doing those, Lebanon will not join that path. And we are hoping we will be able to join that path.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again here on Al-Arabiya News. Amin Salam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn our attention to the United Kingdom, a country that has had 9 prime ministers in the past 30 years, 5 of them in the last 8 years, and 3 of them in the last 2 years and 2 months. Well, let's get a quick reminder of who the British premiers were. As we just saw there, Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, has been in office since July of this year. He was preceded by Rishi Sunak, who was in office for 19 months. Sunak was preceded by Liz Truss, who was in office for just 49 days. And today we're going to be talking about a number of these British leaders, but with a particular focus on Liz Truss. Well, we're joined now by the British historian and educator, Sir Anthony Selden. Sir Anthony, thank you for joining us. You've written biographies of all the British Prime Ministers going back to John Major, the most recent of which was published a couple of months ago and is about the shortest serving British Prime Minister in history, which is, of course, Liz Truss, who was in office for 49 days. The title of that best-selling book, which you can see on your screens there, is Truss at number 10, How Not to Be Prime Minister. The title in itself is somewhat revealing. Thank you again for joining us, Sir Anthony. I mean, 384 pages about someone who served for 49 days. To be fair, that's about half the number of pages you wrote for your Boris Johnson biography. But tell us a little bit about how you wrote so much about Truss, someone who had such a short tenure.
Well, Tom, very nice to be on your excellent programme. And the book is really an exploration of why it matters. Political leadership matters in democracies, and how to be Prime Minister, and why so many have not performed anywhere near as effectively as they should. The last really effective British Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher, and she fell almost 35 years ago. I mean, that's a third of a century. And I think in my experience of a lifetime, really, of writing about prime ministers, there are 10 rules that prime ministers need to follow if they are to be successful. And spectacularly and unswervingly, Liz Truss broke every single one of those 10 rules. And that explains why she had the incredible achievement, if that is what it is, of being Britain's shortest ever surviving prime minister in over 300 years.
Yes, and you make the point in your book quite early on that 49 days doesn't sound quite so bad when you compare it to some of the, for example, Spanish prime ministers of the last couple of hundred years, 9 of whom who've had stints of less than 10 days, you point out. But you do also say early in the book that from the get-go, the response to trust was tepid, you said. We all noticed it didn't feel right. I'm just wondering where you think it all went so wrong for her.
Well, the general election victory that's so important to a British Prime Minister, as it has been to Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister at the moment, it's very important they win their own general election victory, because that gives them a confidence and a mandate and a legitimacy. And the general election victory was won in December 2019, not by her, but by Boris Johnson. And so when she succeeded Johnson, many in the party were very angry because they still wanted Johnson to be the leader. And she didn't have broad support from the Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. So what she should have done, and what really any sensible leader would have done, would have been to reach out and win those people over. But instead, she just took no time to try to befriend them and to bring them on side. She just went ahead with her agenda and somehow assumed that she had her own general election mandate and entitlement to embark the country on the boldest economic reform programme since Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher spent 2 and more years before she started bringing her own policies into play. Liz Truss spent barely 2 days before she started unleashing her own. So that sense of timing is very important for political leaders, and she didn't have it, and she didn't have the political nous to know that you have to keep your MPs on side, because lose them and you are gone.
Yeah, we're going to come back to talk about Liz Truss in just a moment, but I just want to pick up on what you said about it not feeling right for Liz Truss right at the get-go, and also what you were saying about her not winning her own election. Because, of course, Sir Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, and I imagine you're taking notes for one of your future biographies, I'm wondering whether it feels right with him, in your opinion.
So this is very interesting, because the British general election in July of this year, the Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer did very, very well in terms of the numbers of MPs. I mean, a dazzling majority in the House of Commons, but he didn't do at all well on the votes in the country. So barely a third of people voted for him. So he has to be very careful, not of his own MPs in the House of Commons, as Liz Truss needed to be careful, but he needs to be very careful to make certain he doesn't alienate people in the country, because he doesn't have that broad support that even Tony Blair had, particularly in 1997 and 2001 when he won his own landslide election victories. So they have different reasons for being cautious and careful.
Going back to Liz Truss, you say, quote, she came from nowhere to being a serious contender in the leadership race in the space of a matter of days or weeks. You also say there were some in the party who saw her as, quote, fundamentally silly. And I'm just wondering how someone who people in the party regard as being fundamentally silly ever make it to frontline politics in the first place.
Well, I think it's not dissimilar to Boris Johnson. And people knew, the Conservative MPs knew that he would be a risk and a liability, voting him in to be the party leader and Prime Minister after Theresa May, that they knew that he wasn't, didn't work very hard, couldn't be very consistent, wasn't very good with administration. But they thought it was a risk that was worth taking, partly because there simply weren't the strong Conservative candidates with the ability, with the popular appeal. And it was a different kind of risk. And of course, it worked with Boris Johnson because he succeeded Theresa May in the summer of 2019 and went on to win his landslide, as we said, in December 2019. So that gamble paid off at least for a while because he was an election winner, but then he was no good at being prime minister, and he lost the confidence because he wasn't decisive. He didn't steer the country in any clear direction. He couldn't deal with crises well. And it was a different kind of gamble with Liz Truss. She does have popular appeal. She had a very clear Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan style agenda. Seemed to make a lot of sense with the country having such sluggish growth, but the party knew that it would be a risk. With her, it was that she can lack judgment, that she can be very impulsive. I think that's what's meant by the when you say the word silly. I think that's what they are thinking of, that she didn't have that kind of ability to hold back and to weigh up all the options before leaping in. And, again, as with Boris Johnson, that proved to be a mistake. And not everyone would agree with that. But with Liz Truss, I think everyone would agree, apart from herself and one or two supporters, that it was a mistake to put her in because she blew up the country. And she went for a very impulsive budget. She didn't check that she was doing everything properly. And the country suffered, and it was a big factor in the Conservatives losing the July 2024 general election, and it's been a big source of damage to the country, its credibility abroad, and it makes it look like Italy with this constant transition of prime ministers. Britain had 5 prime ministers in 9 years. Now, that hasn't happened before. Very, very unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether you perhaps would attribute blame to what happened before Theresa May took office a bit more. I should point out that you did say in one of your other interviews that you feel that Boris Johnson cheapened the United Kingdom. I just wonder what exactly you meant by that.
So Boris Johnson had many of the qualities that you need to be a good leader. He had optimism. He is a splendid communicator. He has a big vision, but he couldn't be serious. Ultimately, he found it very hard to be serious about anything at all. And it's a job in particular of a Conservative Prime Minister. I mean, Conservative means that you conserve the state, preserve it, honour it. But he didn't do that. And he humiliated the monarchy, the late Queen Elizabeth, which made her very angry in the prorogation of Parliament. She thought that was intrusive. He belittled the civil service, particularly the Treasury. He attacked them. He attacked the judiciary, and one by one, he attacked many of the institutions that make up the British state. And in his own behaviour, his personal conduct, his inability to give that kind of example to other people inside and outside politics, of what it means to be a hard worker, to show integrity, to show sacrifice, to show judgment, to have principles, to be honest. All of these were called into question, and trust in British government that was running low anyway declined significantly under him. So that was the sad story, and even his supporters who were desperate for him to become prime minister, by the end, almost all of them had felt that he simply wasn't capable of doing it. It's like having somebody as captain of a football team who might have some of the qualities of being a captain, of being able to communicate and enthuse everybody, but they're no good at football. He was no good at politics, or government in particular.
Yeah, and I think this is an extension of what you're saying, but you've said that recent British leaders have tended to be all about trashing without reforming. I mean, you're talking about trashing institutions, trashing things, but without offering any suitable replacement. I mean, do you think American politics is perhaps having an overarching influence on British politics and the style of it?
Maybe. I mean, the whole notion formed in part by digital technology that we have to destroy, we have to be disruptive, we have to fundamentally reorganize and replace. And look, there's a lot of truth in that. If we look at the British state, if we look at the judiciary, the police, the health service, the civil service, the military, indeed, we can see that there are lots of areas where improvements need to come in, but just to denigrate them without improving them, well, that's not what leaders do. Leaders should be supporting while also transforming, whereas he was destructive without making any of those institutions better at all, or indeed the great prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, the Labour leader Clement Attlee, Winston Churchill, they left the state and they left the country and the union stronger than when they inherited office. So now Donald Trump, who knows what he's going to do. He didn't leave the institutions of American government stronger when he ceased to be the president in January 2021. Let's see what he does this time round. He's making very threatening noises about the FBI and the CIA and the whole quality of government, and he's bringing in reformers to slash the size of government, and I'm sure that needs to happen. The question is, can he retain the best people? Can he retain the morale of the institutions that make up the American state? Any country on earth of the 220 are dependent, every single one, of all different kinds of political system. They all depend upon officials to run the engine of the state. And if you denigrate and collapse morale, then you don't get a high-quality, high-performing public service. And that's what we'll see. Maybe Donald Trump will pull it off. Who knows?
The turnover of British prime ministers has been high, as you pointed out, and I'm assuming that as the nation's biographer of prime ministers in chief, that's kept you very busy and meant you've had some pretty tight deadlines turning books around. You're sort of 2 biographies behind at the moment because the Trust book has only just come out. Then, of course, I'm assuming you're working on your Rishi Sunak one. Then there'll be the Saqr Starmer one. Do you ever anticipate writing a biography about Nigel Farage?
Well, if that means will Nigel Farage become Prime Minister? Well, if he was to become Prime Minister, I would certainly write on him. But I wouldn't write on him. So Nigel Farage is unlike, I think, any leader in British political history. So we've had the Prime Minister since 1721. Going on 304 years come next April. there's never been somebody who's come in from an insurgent populist party and made such an impression. So now we can see part of that heritage in Trump himself and in Emmanuel Macron. But who knows? I think it's unlikely that he will become prime minister. But one thing we know is that there is extraordinary, supreme volatility at the moment in elections, both for sitting governments and for challenger governments. It's very hard to predict. There's a lot of disillusion with the lack of economic growth in Europe, and where people are cross, angry by their poor economic prospects, they do tend to turn to extremes of both the left and the right. So there is Nigel Farage sitting very prettily on the right. It is not at all impossible, even if I think unlikely, that he will become prime minister. But who knows?
Yeah, I mean, of course, for the benefit of our viewers, Nigel Farage heads up the Reform right-wing political party. And do you think it's fair to say that perhaps the common denominator for a lot of the chaos that we've seen in British politics these last 8 years coincides quite neatly, in fact, with the Brexit referendum?
So the Brexit referendum that took place in mid-2016, I think, was both a cause but also a consequence of a deep malaise in the country, in Britain, which also exists in particular in Europe. But you can see echoes of it in South Korea, for example. So in Europe, where you have Europe used to be the powerhouse of the world in the 19th century and for the first part of the 20th century. But since, in particular, the late 20th century and in particular the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, growth has been sluggish in Europe, in particular in contrast, well, obviously to China, but in contrast to the United States. And that in part explained Brexit. The belief was that Europe is very overly bureaucratized, too much red tape, too many restrictions for entrepreneurs, creativity, business flourishing. And it was a desire to get sovereignty back away out of the EU and back into Britain. And of course, the fact that it hasn't worked out, there hasn't been growth since. And even the big claim of getting more money into the NHS hasn't happened, and getting immigration down hasn't happened. So it appears that those who voted for Brexit were lied to. That further stokes up unrest, and the belief is, it wasn't Brexit that was wrong, but it's that Brexit hasn't been implemented properly, and the people in charge of the Conservatives, in charge of the government since Brexit, haven't been, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss included, Rishi Sunak included, didn't pursue the Brexit ideal. Now, Nigel Farage promises to do a proper Brexit and no doubt have a trade relationship with the US. And so it's an attractive promise, even if it's unachievable.
Just lastly, and briefly, because I'm sure you have to move on, but there have been, as we've been saying, 9 prime ministers of the UK in the last 30 years. I just want to ask you, in very simple terms, who was the best and who was the worst of them?
So that is an extraordinary number, 9 in 30 years. I think the worst, that's easy. I mean, the worst was Boris Johnson in terms of discrediting the country and making promises that he didn't fulfill. I mean, he made Brexit happen as the head of the Brexit campaigning organisation, but he didn't yield the benefits from Brexit. Liz Truss also very poor, so I put them at the worst. And amongst the best, I would include certainly winning elections, Tony Blair, but I think he let himself down over the Iraq war. And that is a stain on his premiership. So who else would there be? David Cameron did some good things, but Libya wasn't a success. I think that John Major, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, very much denigrated at the time, but with hindsight, he looks like a very successful hands-on Prime Minister. But Gordon Brown also steered Britain out of the global financial crisis, so I give him credit. I think almost all of them deserve credit. It's been a difficult time to be Prime Minister when the country is not growing.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. So, Anthony Selden, thank you again. Well, that is all we have time for this special edition of Global News Today, wherever you are in the world. And if you're celebrating Christmas, we wish you all the very best.
At Al-Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al-Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peace